You are listening to a voice right now. Not mine, yours. The one narrating these words inside your head. The one you have trusted since childhood to be the sound of you thinking. That voice is not your thought. It is your thought's translator, arriving after the fact and claiming credit for decisions it did not make. Every conscious mind has been listening to a stranger its entire life. The central question is deceptively simple. If the voice in your head is not your thinking, then what is? Most people never ask it, not because the question is difficult, but because the answer dismantles the only witness they have ever trusted to tell them who they are. The assumption is universal, unexamined, and almost certainly wrong, that thinking and talking to ourselves are the same operation. One process, one system. The inner monologue is the mind at work. It is not, and the proof arrived in 1953, inside the skull of a Russian composer. Vissarion Shibalin was, by any reasonable measure, one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished musical minds. A professor at the Moscow Conservatory, a peer of Shostakovich, a man whose Fifth Symphony was considered a masterwork of mid-century orchestral writing. Then, a stroke obliterated his ability to use language. Global aphasia. The clinical term sounds almost gentle compared to what it describes, a total collapse of linguistic function. Shibalin could not speak a coherent sentence. Written text became meaningless marks on paper. The internal narrator, the voice that had presumably accompanied every waking moment of his adult life, went silent. His music did not. What followed should have rewritten the textbooks immediately. Shibalin continued composing. Not fragments, not diminished sketches of former glory, full symphonic works that his colleagues judged to be among his finest. Shibalin's colleagues, including Shostakovich, evaluated the post-stroke compositions and found them to be of undiminished artistic quality, a judgment that entered the medical literature as evidence, not eulogy. The man had lost every word he ever knew. The complex architecture of his creative cognition remained entirely intact. Consider what this means. A mind stripped of language, no inner monologue, no verbal reasoning, no capacity to name a single note on the page, still producing work of extraordinary structural sophistication. The translator had been fired. The thinker kept working. Shibalin was not an anomaly. He was simply the most conspicuous example of a pattern that medicine had been quietly accumulating for decades. Patients with global aphasia, it turns out, can do a remarkable number of things that should be impossible if language and thought are the same system. They solve arithmetic problems. They reason about the intentions of other people. A cognitive feat called theory of mind, which philosophers have spent centuries arguing requires linguistic scaffolding. Complex causal reasoning continues uninterrupted, tracing chains of events backward and forward without a single word to anchor the process. Some of them play chess. Let that settle for a moment. Chess, a game of recursive strategic projection, of modeling an opponent's future decisions 5, 10, 15 moves deep, performed by individuals who cannot produce or understand a single sentence. If thinking required language, this would be like running software without a processor. The games were played, the moves were sound, and the theorists who insisted on the unity of language and thought were left holding a position that the evidence had quietly abandoned. The formal scientific establishment took considerably longer to catch up. At MIT McGovern Institute for Brain Research, neuroscientist Evelina Fedorenko spent a decade running functional imaging studies that arrived at a conclusion her field found deeply inconvenient. Language processing mechanisms, her lab demonstrated, are anatomically and functionally distinct from the mechanisms supporting reasoning, knowledge, and abstract thought, not overlapping systems. Separate networks, housed in different neural architecture, activating independently. This meant something rather unsettling. The voice narrating your experience, the one you are using right now to process these very sentences, is not the engine of your cognition. It is the press secretary. It steps to the podium after the decisions have been made, reads a prepared statement, and takes questions as though it were in charge. The real work happens somewhere else, somewhere pre-verbal, somewhere ancient, somewhere that operated for hundreds of thousands of years before the first human syllable was ever uttered. Language, Fedorenko's research confirms, is a relatively late cultural invention. By the time it emerged in our species, the perceptual, motor, and cognitive capacities that define human intelligence were already fully operational. The voice arrived late to a party that was already in full swing. It has been claiming it organized the entire event ever since. What remains, and what Fedorenko herself describes as a big, open, and highly controversial question, is the nature of that deeper layer. If thought is not made of words, what is it made of? What does cognition look like before the translator gets involved? If you have a theory, drop it in the comments, because the answer the researchers found is one that most people, upon hearing it, instinctively reject. Not because the evidence is weak, because accepting it requires dismantling something that feels as intimate as a heartbeat. The assumption that the voice narrating your life is the one living it. Consider a simple calculation. Language, by conservative anthropological estimates, emerged somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 years ago, a range that itself remains contested, with symbolic behavior predating any agreed threshold by tens of thousands of years. The genus Homo has been walking upright, crafting tools, navigating complex social hierarchies, and solving survival problems for roughly 2 million years. That gap is not a footnote, it is an abyss. For over 95% of the time that creatures recognizably like us have existed on this planet, not a single one of them possessed a word for anything. And yet they thrived. Migrations across continents without maps, crossing land bridges that no longer exist. Acheulean hand axes fashioned with a symmetry so precise that modern engineers have studied the geometry. Burials conducted with apparent intentionality, bodies arranged, objects placed beside them, implying abstract reasoning about states of being that had not yet occurred. All of this without language. All of this in silence. The implication is disquieting. If thought required language, none of it could have happened. Homo erectus could not have planned a coordinated hunt across open savanna. Homo heidelbergensis could not have controlled fire, a technology demanding causal reasoning about combustion, fuel management, and the patience to tend a flame through the night. The cognitive architecture was already sophisticated, already layered, already capable of abstraction, long before the first syllable was ever uttered. Language did not create thought, it colonized it. What Evelina Fedorenko's laboratory at MIT demonstrated through a decade of neuroimaging was the physical proof of this temporal logic. Subjects inside fMRI machines were asked to solve complex reasoning tasks, mathematical problems, spatial puzzles, questions requiring them to infer the mental states of other people. The language regions of their brains remained conspicuously dormant, dark, unrecruited. The cognitive heavy lifting was happening elsewhere entirely, in networks that have nothing to do with syntax, grammar, or vocabulary. Two systems, anatomically separate, functionally independent. This is not a metaphor, it is a measurement. The most revealing evidence, however, comes not from brain scans of healthy subjects, but from the catastrophic natural experiments that neurologists encounter in stroke wards. Patients with global aphasia, a condition in which language is not merely impaired but effectively annihilated, present a paradox that the language equals thought hypothesis cannot survive. They cannot speak. They cannot comprehend speech. They cannot read, write, or access their internal monologue. They can still think. Documented cases show aphasic patients solving multi-step arithmetic, playing chess at competitive levels, navigating the inferential demands of social interaction with startling competence. The Russian composer Vissarion Shebelin suffered a stroke that destroyed his capacity for language so thoroughly that clinical assessments classified him as severely aphasic. He continued composing symphonies. His colleagues evaluated the post-stroke work and found it indistinguishable in quality from what he had produced before. The music required no words. Neither, it turned out, did the mind that created it. Consider what happens in ordinary human experience, though most people have never framed it this way. A decision arrives. Which route to drive? Whether to trust someone? The answer materializes before the inner voice has finished constructing its sentence. Then the narration begins. Justification, rationalization, the post hoc story of why the decider decided what was already decided. The voice claims authorship of a conclusion, it merely reported. This pattern is not anecdotal. Benjamin Libet's experiments, published in 1983, measured the temporal gap directly. The readiness potential, neural activity preceding voluntary movement, was already building 300 to 500 milliseconds before subjects reported any conscious awareness of intending to act. Half a second. The brain had already committed before the voice even knew there was a choice on the table. What Fedorenko's work adds to Libet's timeline is the anatomical confirmation. Language is not merely late to the decision. It occupies entirely different neural real estate from the decision itself. The narrator is not the author. It is middle management, drafting memos about strategies that were implemented before it arrived at the office. The question this raises is not academic. It is, in the most literal sense, personal. If the voice in your head is not the one making your choices, if it serves merely as publicist for a deeper, wordless intelligence that operates beneath conscious access, then the entity you have spent your entire life calling I may be a translation, not an original. And if the translation is all you have ever known, what does the original sound like? Fedorenko's team had a theory. They called it the language as tool hypothesis. And when they tested it against the oldest objection in philosophy of mind, the language as tool hypothesis did exactly what its name suggested. It demoted language from architect of thought to something closer to a courier service. Fedorenko's team at MIT proposed that language evolved not as the engine of cognition, but as a communication device, a way to externalize thoughts that already existed in a wordless, pre-linguistic format and transmit them between minds. The mechanism of thinking itself required no grammar, no syntax, no vocabulary whatsoever. Words were packaging. The product had already been manufactured in silence. This was not a fringe conjecture from a philosopher with too much free time. It was a testable claim, and Fedorenko tested it. The methodology was deceptively elegant. Using functional MIRI, her laboratory mapped brain activation during tasks that demanded genuine intellectual effort, mathematical reasoning, spatial navigation, logical inference, music composition, theory of mind. In every case, the brain's dedicated language network remained dormant, quiet, uninvolved. The regions responsible for constructing sentences and processing words sat idle while the actual cognitive labor happened elsewhere, in domain general networks that operated without any linguistic scaffolding at all. Not reduced activity, not partial engagement, silence. What lit up the language network was communication, explaining one's reasoning to another person, reading a sentence, listening to speech. The moment thought turned inward, the words switched off. By contrast, the moment thought turned outward, toward another human mind, the language regions activated with conspicuous urgency. The implication carried a certain antiseptic brutality. Language is social technology, not private infrastructure. Consider what this means across cultures. The Pirohan people of the Amazon speak a language that lacks number words, fixed color terms, and recursive clauses. Their problem-solving abilities remain entirely consistent with populations whose inner monologues unfold in languages of staggering complexity. Mandarin speakers, whose tonal system restructures the phonological loop of working memory, perform identically on non-verbal reasoning tasks to speakers of Finnish, Swahili, or American English. The voice changes, the cognition does not. The narrator is cultural, the author is biological. This distinction, it turns out, was not news to everyone. Contemplative traditions across millennia had arrived at the same conclusion through radically different means. Vipassana meditation, a practice dating back over 2,000 years, operates on an explicit premise. The verbal stream of consciousness is an obstacle, not an instrument. The goal is cessation of the internal narrator, a state practitioners describe as bare attention, cognition stripped of its linguistic clothing. For centuries, Western neuroscience dismissed this as mysticism, the kind of subjective report that dissolves under empirical scrutiny. Then the empirical scrutiny arrived and confirmed it. Neuroimaging studies of experienced meditators reveal a measurable reduction in default mode network activity, the brain region most associated with self-referential internal narration, coupled with sustained or enhanced activity in attention and executive function networks. Ford continues. Reasoning persists. The monologue stops. What monks had described as silence beneath the noise corresponded with uncomfortable precision to the same dissociation Fedorenko's laboratory had mapped in aphasia patients and healthy subjects alike. Two entirely independent investigative traditions, one empirical, one contemplative, converging on an identical conclusion across a gap of 24 centuries, deserves more than a footnote. Return then to Vissarion Schiebelin, the Soviet composer who suffered a catastrophic left hemisphere stroke, lost the ability to speak, to comprehend speech, to read or write a single word, and who subsequently composed his Fifth Symphony, a work Shostakovich himself praised for its brilliant creative activity. Schiebelin did not survive despite losing language. His compositional mind had never required it. The stroke did not damage the composer. It removed a translator who had been narrating the composer's work, claiming co-authorship the entire time. What remained was the original intelligence, silent, intact, prolific, finally operating without an intermediary taking credit. The publicist was fired. The artist did not notice. That sentence contains the entire answer to the question this series began with, though the implications take considerably longer to metabolize. Fedorenko's decade of research established, with the methodical certainty that only neuroimaging and lesion studies can provide, that language networks and cognitive networks occupy separable territories in the human brain. These are not speculations. They are observations, replicated across patients, paradigms, and years. But here the research reaches a boundary. Not because the scientists lacked ambition. The boundary is structural. Neuroscience can map which regions activate during cognition. It can demonstrate, conclusively, that the language network is not among them during complex reasoning tasks. What it cannot do is answer the question that inevitably follows. If language is not thought, then what, precisely, is the inner voice for? That question departs the jurisdiction of fMRI machines. It enters territory where no controlled experiment can follow. The boundary is methodological, not evasive. Science can tell you what the voice is not. Philosophy must contend with what it is. Consider the practical architecture of this finding. If the inner monologue is a post hoc narration, a verbal translation of decisions the brain has already rendered in some pre-linguistic substrate, then trusting that voice as intuition constitutes a categorical error. The real intuition, the genuine cognitive event, occurred before the first syllable of internal speech materialized. What most people experience as their gut feeling is already the rationalization, dressed in the syntax of conviction, arriving after the silent decider has committed to a course of action. The voice does not deliberate, it announces. Experts across every domain have described this architecture without possessing the neuroscience to explain it. Surgeons operating at the highest level report that their finest decisions emerge without conscious verbal reasoning. The hands move, the judgment executes, and only afterward does the narrative catch up. Concert pianists performing Rachmaninoff do not internally verbalize fingering choices at 12 notes per second. Athletes in flow states consistently describe the cessation of self-talk as the precondition for peak performance, not its consequence. Mastery, across disciplines and centuries, reveals a consistent phenomenology. The narrator falls silent and the work improves. The voice is not the craftsman. It is the commentator who believes the microphone makes him part of the team. By contrast, the moments of greatest cognitive failure, choking under pressure, overthinking a put, freezing mid-sentence in a presentation, share a common feature. The voice gets loud. The stenographer seizes the controls from the pilot, who actually knows how to fly. The central question, what is the voice in your head? If not the thing doing the thinking, now permits a direct response. The inner monologue is a linguistic interface, a translation layer that converts pre-verbal cognition into the serial, symbolic format of language. Not the origin of thought, but its transcriber, recording decisions made in a deeper cognitive architecture that predates spoken language by hundreds of thousands of years. Every surgeon whose hands knew before the words arrived is the proof. The significance extends beyond neuroscience into the infrastructure of how modern institutions operate. Education systems are built on the assumption that articulation equals understanding, that a student who cannot verbalize a concept has not grasped it. Legal systems equate the capacity for verbal testimony with the capacity for truth. Therapeutic models from psychoanalysis to cognitive behavioral therapy treats the spoken or internally narrated thought as the primary unit of mental life, the object to be examined and restructured. Fedorenko's findings do not merely challenge these frameworks. They suggest that each one has been interrogating the translator while the author sits in another room entirely unexamined, because no one thought to ask whether the person speaking was the person who knew. The architecture is not broken. It was never designed to do what civilization assumed it was doing. Schabalin lost every word he had ever known. The music did not hesitate. The voice narrating this sentence inside the reader's skull finished its performance after the meaning had already landed. A translator speaking to an audience that understood the original, it has been doing this without interruption or acknowledgement for an entire lifetime. If the voice is not required for thought, and not responsible for decisions, and not the source of creativity, the question Fedorenko's research raises but cannot answer is the only one that remains. What is it for?